Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My question is to follow up on the discussion related to civic engagement that I know has been the thread of a lot of the discussion and questions so far. I'm directing these specifically to Ms. Connolly and Ms. Rosenberger, but I welcome the other two witnesses to add anything to this discussion. The European Union's East Stratcom Task Force, established in 2015, seeks to raise awareness of Russian disinformation and to educate the public about disinformation and improve media literacy overall, particularly when it comes to the internet and social media. The Swedish government, for example, instituted a nationwide digital competence curriculum for elementary school-aged children, teaching them how to spot fake news and discern the difference between reliable and unreliable sources. As a former intelligence officer with CIA, but also as a mother of 3 young children, I do believe our national security strength begins with the American people, especially with our children. And that means ensuring they have the necessary education and tools to make objective, evidence-based decisions. So do you all believe the European Union's approach in focusing on education and public awareness training, and especially with a pivot towards programs focused on children, can be or is an effective strategy to counter disinformation? And are there any other countries pursuing this type of program that you've been aware of that you think are successful that we should try and learn from?
Well, thank you. I think those are really important questions. I would note just a couple of points. The first is that I think this idea of building resiliency here at home is absolutely critical to dealing with so many of these challenges, whether that's resiliency of our financial system on some of the tactics we were speaking about earlier, or resilience on the information side. These are vulnerabilities in our own societies that are being exploited, and we need to recognize that. Public awareness and education is absolutely a big part of that. I would sort of parcel them out into 2 different pieces. Public awareness about the threat requires real, consistent, strategic messaging. Ms. Connolly mentioned earlier, some of the programs we've seen on the counterterrorism front. I think it is very important that we think about simple messages that we can replicate. Sweden, I think, may have been mentioned earlier as an example to look at for some of the tactics that they have used. You mentioned the awareness campaigns, but they've also done a lot of really good work up and down the board at raising public awareness. The one thing I would say that the East Stratcom team has focused a good bit of their energy on is on debunking specific stories, false narratives. I would suggest that the research shows that that is of limited utility, and that in fact sometimes it risks actually amplifying the content you're seeking to debunk. I believe there is a threshold level at which it is imperative for governments to step in and sort of demythologize some of those narratives, but I would argue that that's not the path to go down. The last point I would make, though, is while I think that focusing on our children is extremely important, most of the research shows that, in fact, it is senior citizens, people who age 60 to 65 and older, depending on which study you look at, that have been the most vulnerable to mis and disinformation. And so I think we can't discount looking at that part of the population, which has not grown up with so much technology in their lives, that may not be as accustomed to using it, and that we need to make sure that we don't focus so much on just the younger generation that we lose sight of the other parts of the population that remain vulnerable.
Thank you again for the question. I think the EU Stratcom, it's a good thought. It's so under-resourced, sort of buried. It's not proactive. NATO's Strategic Communications Center, I would argue, is certainly giving us leading tools of what's happening, but you're right, the public education component is missing. Sweden is the perfect model. I don't know of other EU countries that have done sort of a similar at the grade school level work, and I think they see it as a part of what their defense concept, as you may well know, is total defense. It's about civilian defense, that everyone is responsible for defending the nation, and it begins with them individually. That's preparing your home in case of disaster, but that's also preparing your mind for being influenced inappropriately. So we have to somehow message that patriotism and public awareness, that this is something that goes together. As I mentioned in my written statement and my oral statement, we are at war. It's just a different kind of war, and we have to convince people that they have to take personal responsibility in making sure that what they're reading or what they're hearing from families and friends, is that right? Do I have the right information? How can you be a truth detective, if you will? And that's part of our patriotic duty, but we have to put it, I think, in those terms.